Hello again. It's Shabbat Shalom. I'm Reverend Mark Anthony Lester. My associate pastor is John Lee Lester. And this is Soldiers of Light Christian Assembly, coming to you with some more studies from First Fruits of Zion and the Chronicles of the Messiah, with reading from the Daily Hebrew Gospels, which is, we will be reading out of Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29, Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, and Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9, out of the Vine of David Daily Hebrew Gospels. And this is called the Death of John, out of the Chronicles of the Messiah. But first we'll read the Daily Hebrew Gospels, and this is a Hebrew root ministry. God bless you all. I'm glad that you could join us. This is the last lesson out of Book 2. We'll be going to Book 3 next. In Yeshua Nazareth's name, Adonai Elohim, praise be unto him forever and ever. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu et Yeshua ben kai kamoshnu golinu moshnu kapita devadu ve'et shefri berite kadesh le'emenu et kilimim. Baruch atah Adonai noten Yeshua b'Yeshua HaMashiach. Praise be you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us Yeshua, your Son, as our Messiah, our Redeemer, our Savior, our Atonement, and our Lord, and the books of the New Covenant to our people and to all the peoples. Praise be you, O Lord, giver of salvation in Yeshua the Messiah. Now we go to the Daily Hebrew Gospels, and we'll start in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. King Herodes heard the report of him, for his name was well known, and he said, Yochanan the Immerser has been awakened from the dead. That is why the forces are working in him. Some were saying he was Eliyahu, while others said that he was a prophet like one of the prophets. Herodes heard and said, Yochanan, whose head I removed, has risen from the dead. For Herodes was the one who had sent orders and captured Yochanan and bound him in jail for the sake of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philippus, whom he had taken as a wife. For Yochanan had said to Herodes, the wife of your brother is not permitted for you. And Herodias held a grudge against him and sought a way to put him to death, but she had not found one. For Herodias feared Yochanan, since he knew that he was a righteous and holy man, so he protected him, and he did many things, but it pleased him to listen to him. Then the right day happened when Herodes made a banquet on his birthday for his nobles, officers of thousands, and leaders of the Galilee. The daughter of Herodias came and danced, and it was pleasing in the eyes of Herodes and in the eyes of those who were reclining with him. The king said to the young woman, ask me for whatever you desire, and I will give it to you. And he swore to her, saying, all that you ask me, I will give to you, up to half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She said, the head of Yochanan the Immerser. She hurried quickly to come to the king and asked, saying, what I want is for you to give me the head of Yochanan the Immerser on the platter now. The king was very grieved, but on account of his oath and on account of those reclining with him, he did not want to turn her face away. Immediately the king sent one of the executioners and commanded him to bring his head. He went and cut off his head in the jail and brought it in the dish and gave it to the young woman, and the young woman gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard, they came and carried away his body and placed it in the tomb. All right, now we go to Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. At that time, Herodes, the tetrarch of the province, heard the report about Yeshua. He said to his young man, this is Yochanan the Immerser, who has been awakened from the dead. That is why such forces are working in him. For Herodes had captured Yochanan, bound him, and placed him in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philippus. For Yochanan had said to him, she is forbidden for you. Herodes sought to kill him, but was afraid of the crowd, since they considered him to be a prophet. On On Herodes' birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them, and it was pleasing in the eyes of Herodes. So he swore to her and said, "What does your soul request? I will give it to you." Now her mother had put the words in her mouth, so she requested, saying, "Give me the head of Yochanan the immerser here on a platter." The king was troubled, but on account of his oath and those reclining with him, he ordered it to be given to her. He sent orders and removed Yochanan's head. He sent orders and removed Yochanan's head in prison. They brought his head on a platter, handed it to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came forward and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Yeshua. When Yeshua heard this, he departed from there in a boat to a desolate place, and no one was with him. When the crowd of people heard, they followed him on foot from the towns. Yeshua went out and saw the great crowd of people, and he left moved for them and healed those among them who were weak. Now we go to Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Herodes the Tetrarch heard about all that happened through him, and his spirit was agitated, because there were some who said Yochanan had been awakened from the dead. There were some who said Eliyahu had appeared, and there were others who said a prophet had arisen from among the ancient prophets. Herodes said, "I have removed the head of Yochanan from him, but who is this that I am hearing things like this about?" And he sought to see him. This concludes the reading from the Daily Hebrew Gospels. Now we will go into the lesson from Chronicles of the Messiah from First Fruits of Zion. The death of John. Report in Tiberias. King Herodes heard the report of him, for his name was well known. Marcos chapter 6, verse 14. The Master sent out the 12 disciples in pairs. They went from town to town in the Galilee, proclaiming the kingdom of heaven and performing miraculous signs and wonders in the name of Yeshua of Nazareth. In their wake, Yeshua's fame continued to grow, and crowds continued to gather around him. Their mission may have lasted several weeks, several months, or even a year or so. While they ministered in the towns of the Galilee, reports about Yeshua of Nazareth began to arrive in Tiberias, the capital city of Galilee, the city of Herod Antipas. Some 10 years before the Master began his ministry in the Galilee, Herod Antipas built Tiberias on the western shore of Lake Galilee and established it as his administrative center. He named it after Emperor Tiberius, part of his continuing campaign to curry favor from Rome and attain the title of king. Antipas considered himself the rightful sole heir of his father, King Herod the Great, and therefore heir to the king of the Jews. To his consternation, the Roman emperors refused to grant him the title. He chose to build Tiberias upon a rocky projection above the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, not far from some natural hot springs. Our Master Yeshua based his ministry out of the nearby fishing village of Capernaum. Though Tiberias was an important metropolitan center, not more than 12 miles down the western shore from Capernaum, Yeshua and his disciples never set foot in Tiberias. They had good reason to avoid it. Herod Antipas built the city atop an old Jewish cemetery. He disregarded the Torah's mandates regarding clean and unclean, and he disregarded the sanctuary of the tombs, partly as a matter of ritual purity and partly in protest to Antipas. The religious of Galilee declared Tiberias an unclean city. Observant Jews did not walk its streets, and any who did considered themselves ritually defiled, requiring ceremonial purification with the ashes of a red heifer. The city presented observant Jews with other problems too. Antipas built it as more of a Greek city than a Jewish city. He built a stadium and a splendid palace, adorning the walls with forbidden graven images like the traditional Jews of their day. Yeshua and his disciples avoided Tiberias. Even when the gospel story does not specifically mention Herod Antipas, he nonetheless lurks behind the scenes. His arrest of John the Immerser signaled the official beginning of the Master's ministry. The watchful nearby presence of Herod Antipas explains the Master's general policy of keeping his identity concealed, his frequent admonitions to those he yielded to tell no one, his occasional tactical retreats to the territories of Phoenicia, Caesarea Philippi, and the Decapolis, and his aversion to large crowds. Yeshua knew that Messianic acclamation might force Antipas to arrest and kill him. Herod Antipas wanted to be king of the Jews. He could not afford to let a legitimate son of David start making popular claims to the throne. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed. Luke chapter 9, verse 7. Even Herod's administrators and government officials brought him stories about Yeshua's deeds in their districts. The reports alarmed Herod. Some compared the miracle-working rabbi to the prophets of old. Some wondered if he might not be Elijah or one of the prophets raised from the dead. Particularly unnerving, some said that John the Immerser had risen from the dead. Luke chapter 9, verse 8. Back from the dead. And he said, Yochanan the Immerser has been awakened from the dead. That is why the forces are working in him. Marcos chapter 6, verse 14. Antipas feared that Yeshua might be John the Immerser raised from the dead. Antipas was a superstitious man, and he could not help but notice the coincidence. No sooner had he ordered the execution of John the Immerser than miracle reports about Yeshua of Nazareth began to arrive. Who else could it be? He kept saying, John, whom I beheaded, has risen. Mark chapter 6, verse 16. Herod said, I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things? Luke chapter 9, verse 9. A simple inquiry into the matter was sufficient to dispel any fear that John had literally come back from the dead. Antipas must have quickly learned that Yeshua of Nazareth had been seen with John the Immerser and had been active in the Galilee for all the months that John sat in prison in Marcurius. Nevertheless, Antipas believed that the same supernatural force and personality once active in John had now come to work in Yeshua in order to avenge John's death. He feared Yeshua the way a guilty murderer might fear his victim's ghost. From then on, Antipas kept trying to see him. Mark chapter 6, verses 17 through 29 steps aside from the narrative of Yeshua about Yeshua and his disciples in order to tell briefly the story of John's arrest and subsequent execution at the hands of Herod Antipas. Herod and John. For Herodas was the one who had sent and captured Yochanan and bound him in jail for the sake of Herodia, the wife of his brother Philippus, whom he had taken as a wife. Marcos chapter 6, verse 17. Sometime earlier, just before the first reports about Yeshua of Nazareth began to reach the Tetrarch's ears, Herod Antipas had put John the Immerser to death. How did it happen? John the Immerser carried out most of his ministry in Perea, a territory belonging to Antipas. His popular ministry and fiery preaching drew large crowds, and Herod Antipas liked to listen to John as well. Mark says he used to enjoy listening to him, but John's message left Antipas very perplexed. Mark chapter 6, verse 20. John's proclamation of the kingdom of heaven seemed to suggest the potential of revolution. The prophet's adamant calls for repentance and radical piety also disturbed him. As a son of the Herodian dynasty, Herod Antipas had embraced the secular hedronistic environment of the court, and he lived in accordance with Roman values and morals rather than Torah and Judaism. The Herodian aristocracy maintained a pretense of Jewish practice, but for the most part the Herodians were Jewish outwardly but not inwardly, as Paul says, for he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is merely outward in the flesh. Romans chapter 2, verse 28. Apparently Antipas enjoyed a good sermon, but John's preaching had been making him nervous. The constant political and religious unrest among the Galileans made the possibility of revolution an ever-present danger. Antipas knew that any such revolution would target him. Rome's appointment tetrarch It seemed to him that the ministry of John the Immerser might be the flashpoint of such an uprising. Josephus tells about the political threat John's ministry presented to Herod Antipas. The crowds grew around John, and his words greatly inspired the people. Herod began to fear that John's great influence over the people might enable him by some innovation to raise some form of rebellion. The people appeared ready to do anything John directed. Herod thought it best, therefore, to avoid future difficulties by putting him to death and prevented any problems.